She gave the soaked stranger her very last cup of Garri, went to bed hungry, and never expected to see him again. Months later, a lawyer knocked on her door with a sealed envelope bearing her late husband's name. Inside was a letter with one sentence that made her hands shake. "Your husband saved my life, but he never told you what he asked me to protect." To understand how a hungry stranger and a dead man's secret could turn one poor woman's whole world upside down, you have to go back 2 years, to the day they lowered Emeka into the grave. Adaeze stood at the edge of the grave in a black wrapper that was already too big for her thinning body. Her husband was gone, taken by an illness that came fast and left faster. She held her 2 children close, 16-year-old Chinelo and little 9-year-old Kalu, and she told herself she would be strong for them. But she did not know that the real burial was not happening in the ground. It was happening in the shadows, where a man in fine clothes was already counting what did not belong to him. That man was Chief Obinna, Emeka's elder brother. He arrived at the burial in a shining car, greeting mourners like a politician, shaking hands, laughing softly at the right moments. And when the crowd had settled, he stood up, cleared his throat, and pulled out a folded document. "My brother, God rest him, left debts, and before he died he signed his house and his workshop to me to settle those debts." The crowd murmured. Adaeze's legs went cold beneath her. She had never heard of any such paper in her life. She wanted to speak, but her throat closed. She looked at Obinna, waiting for him to meet her eyes, waiting for some sign that this was a mistake. He did not look at her. He simply folded the paper back into his pocket, patted little Kalu on the head, and smiled. And in that smile, Adaeze saw something that made her stomach drop. He was not grieving at all. He had been waiting for this day. Within 1 week, Adaeze and her children were told to leave the only home they had ever known. The neighbors watched from their windows as she carried her few bags into the back of a rented pickup. Some pitied her. Others whispered that Emeka must have been a foolish, reckless man to die owing so much. And that was the part that cut deepest. Not losing the house, but hearing her husband, a gentle man who fixed engines and taught boys to read, being called a failure by people who never knew him. They moved into a single rented room in a crowded compound on the poor side of town, where the roof leaked and the walls were thin. At night, Adaeze would lie awake listening to the drip of water into a bucket, holding her sleeping son against her chest, promising the darkness that she would find a way to make things right. But every morning she woke to the same hunger, the same whispers, the same cold shoulders at the market, where women who once greeted her warmly now pretended not to see her. Adaeze took a small spot at the market, selling little sachets of provisions, making barely enough to keep the children fed. And every single evening, Chief Obinna's new signboard on Emeka's old workshop seemed to grow bigger and brighter, mocking her from across the town. But she kept one thing hidden inside her wrapper, tied to a string around her neck, a small brass key her husband had pressed into her hand on his last clear night. "Keep it safe," he whispered. "Don't lose it. Promise me." She never knew what it opened, and she was about to spend 2 years never finding out. Time did not heal Adaeze's family. It wore them down. By the 2nd year, Chinelo had grown quiet and sharp-eyed, ashamed of the compound, ashamed of the second-hand uniform she wore to school. One evening, when Adaeze came home with almost nothing, Chinelo said the words that broke her mother more than the eviction ever had. "Maybe they were right about Daddy," she said, staring at the wall. "Maybe he really did leave us with nothing." Adaeze opened her mouth to defend her husband and found she had no proof to give, only a brass key that opened no door she knew. But the true test of Adaeze's spirit came the day she finally swallowed her pride and went to beg. There was a big community meeting at the town hall, and Chief Obinna was the guest of honor. Adaeze put on her cleanest wrapper, tied the brass key against her chest for courage, and walked into that hall with her back straight, planning to ask her brother-in-law, publicly, respectfully, to let her use a corner of the old workshop so she could earn a living. She did not know she was walking into the most humiliating moment of her life. The hall was full. Traders, teachers, elders, young men with phones in their hands. When Ariaze stepped forward and greeted the gathering, a hush fell. She kept her voice steady, even as her legs trembled beneath her wrapper. "Chief," she said, "I am not here to fight. I only ask for a small corner of my late husband's workshop so I can feed his children." Chief Obina slowly rose from his cushioned chair. He looked at her the way a man looks at dirt on his shoe. "You," he said, loud enough for the back rows to hear, "you come here in front of respectable people to beg?" A few nervous laughs rippled through the hall. Ariaze felt her throat tighten, but she did not lower her eyes. "That workshop belonged to your husband," Obina continued, turning to address the crowd like a performer. "A man who died in debt and shame, a man who could not even provide for his own family." He spread his arms. "And now his widow wants me to reward that failure?" He gave a short, cruel laugh. "Go home. There is nothing here for people like you." Then, in front of the entire town, he turned his back on her and sat down. The silence that followed was worse than the laughter. Ariaze heard the whispers rising around her like insects. She saw two young men lift their phones, recording her shame to share later. She saw an old woman she once respected look away, unable to meet her eyes. Her hands shook, her throat burned, her legs felt as if they would fold beneath her right there on the floor, but she did not fall and she did not cry. She lifted her chin, gathered her wrapper, and walked out of that hall with her head high, even as her heart shattered into pieces inside her chest. And behind her, she heard Chief Obina already laughing at another joke, as if she had never existed at all. She walked home in the fading light, whispering her husband's name, asking a dead man what she was supposed to do now. She had no idea that the answer was already walking toward her through the coming storm. That night, the rain came down like judgment. It hammered the rusted roof and turned the compound paths into rivers of mud. Ariaze sat on the floor of her one room with her two hungry children, and in her small tin there was exactly 1 cup of Garri left. Nothing more. No money until market day. She measured it with her eyes, calculating how to stretch 1 cup between 3 empty stomachs, when a knock came at the door. She opened it to find a stranger standing in the downpour. He was tall but bent with exhaustion, his shirt soaked through and clinging to his thin frame, his shoes caked in mud, his face hollow with hunger. He looked as if he had been walking for days. "Good evening, madam," he said through chattering teeth. "I am looking for a man called Emeka, a mechanic. Please, is this his home?" Her heart clenched at her husband's name. "Emeka was my husband," she said softly, "but he passed on 2 years ago." Something in the stranger's face collapsed, a hope she did not understand, draining right in front of her. He swayed on his feet, and she realized the man was close to fainting from hunger. And in that moment, Ariaze faced the hardest choice a poor mother can face. She looked at her 2 children. She looked at the single cup of Garri, the only thing standing between her family and an empty night. And then she looked back at the starving man shivering in her doorway. Her husband had always said that no one who came to their door in need should ever leave empty. So Ariaze made her decision. She stepped back and welcomed the stranger inside out of the rain. Then, with rain still dripping from the doorframe behind her, this thin widow in a faded blue wrapper knelt at her small stove and poured out every last grain of her Garri into a chipped white bowl. She soaked it, added a pinch of salt because she had nothing else, and held it out to the stranger with both hands. Behind her, in the flickering light of a single kerosene lamp, her 2 children sat pressed against the cracked wall, little Kalu watching that bowl of food with wide, hungry eyes, and Chinelo staring at her mother as if she had lost her mind. The stranger took the bowl, and his hands trembled around it. Areaze's own stomach was painfully empty, but her face was calm and kind. And on the wall above them all hung a small framed photograph of a smiling man in a mechanic's shirt, the one thing no one had managed to take from her. The stranger ate slowly, as if each mouthful was sacred. When he finished, he pressed the bowl to his chest and whispered, "You have given me your last, haven't you?" It was not a question. Areaze said nothing, and then the stranger's eyes drifted upward and landed on the photograph on the wall, and he went completely still. His whole body froze. The bowl slipped slightly in his hands. He rose slowly to his feet, walked to the wall, and stared at the smiling face in the frame as though he had seen a ghost. His breathing turned shallow. "This man," he said, his voice cracking, "this is your husband? This is Emeka?" Areaze nodded, confused. The stranger pressed his hand flat against the wall to steady himself, and when he turned back to her, his eyes were shining with tears he was fighting to hold back. "Where is he buried?" he asked. But before she could answer, he shook his head, wiped his face, and said only, "Thank you. God will remember what you did tonight." Then he set down the bowl, stepped back into the rain, and disappeared into the darkness. Areaze stood in the doorway, listening to the storm, wondering who that man was and why the sight of her dead husband's face had shaken him so deeply. And she went to bed hungry that night, never expecting to see him again. But 3 months later, everything changed. It was a bright, dusty afternoon when a car she did not recognize stopped outside the compound, and a man in a crisp shirt and tie stepped out carrying a leather bag. The neighbors gathered at their doors to watch. The man asked for Areaze by name. When she came out, wiping her hands on her wrapper, he introduced himself as a lawyer and handed her a sealed envelope. On the front, written in ink, was her late husband's full name, Emeka. Her hands began to shake before she even opened it. Inside was a folded letter. She unfolded it slowly, and the first line she read made her legs go weak beneath her. "Your husband saved my life," it said, "but he never told you what he asked me to protect." She had to sit down on the doorstep. The lawyer waited quietly as she read on, her eyes racing across the page, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The letter was from the stranger. His name was Tunde. Years ago, before Areaze had even met Emeka, there had been a fire at the family workshop, a terrible fire that destroyed half the property. The blame had fallen on a young apprentice, a boy who would have been ruined and thrown out onto the street for it. That boy was Tunde. But Emeka knew the truth. The boy was innocent. Emeka stood up in front of the whole family and took the blame himself, protecting the boy and quietly sending him away to start a new life. "Your husband gave up his own good name to save a stranger's son," the letter read. "I swore I would repay him one day. That was why I came back." Areaze pressed the letter to her chest, tears finally spilling down her face. Her husband was not the reckless failure the town believed. He was a man who had sacrificed his reputation to save an innocent boy. But the letter was not finished. The final lines made her breath catch. "There is more that Emeka left in my care, proof that will give you back everything that was stolen from you and your children. The brass key he gave you opens a box in the old district bank. Inside that box is the truth. Take the lawyer, go quickly, and trust no one until it is in your hands." Areaze's fingers flew to the key around her neck. After 2 years, she finally knew what it opened. Justice was suddenly impossibly close. For the first time in 2 years, Areaze allowed herself to hope. She was not alone in that hope. Over the past months, a kind woman from the compound named Neka had become her closest friend, a warm, church-going woman who prayed with her, walked with her, and listened to her cry about all that Obina had done. When Areaze rushed home clutching the letter, it was Neka she told everything to. The fire, the key, the bank box, the proof that would finally bring Chief Obina down. "God has heard you," Nneka said, hugging her tightly, her eyes glistening. "Tomorrow, everything changes." And Adeaze believed her with her whole heart, but she should not have. The next morning, Adeaze and the lawyer drove to the old district bank. Her hands were sweating around the little brass key as the manager led them into the vault. They found the box. The key slid in and turned with a soft click. Adeaze held her breath and lifted the lid. The box was empty. Completely, utterly empty. Adeaze stared into the empty box, her ears ringing, the room spinning around her. "How?" she whispered. "Nobody knew. Nobody knew but—" And then the truth hit her like cold water. Only one person had known. She had told only one person about the key and the box the night before, Nneka. She stumbled out of the bank, her chest tight, and rushed to find her friend. But Nneka's room in the compound was locked and cleared out. A neighbor said she had left before dawn in a car, a big car, the kind Chief Obina drove, and that was when Adeaze understood the cruelest thing of all. The warm, praying woman who had comforted her for months, who had wiped her tears and held her hand, had been placed in her life by Obina himself. Every secret Adeaze had ever shared, every hope she had whispered, had gone straight to the enemy. The friendship was a trap from the very first day. Adeaze sank onto the ground outside the empty room, and for the first time she truly wanted to give up. The proof was gone. Her one witness, Tunde, had returned to the city to arrange legal help, and now his phone rang endlessly with no answer. She began to fear the worst, that the stranger had used her, taken whatever he needed, and vanished for good, just like everyone had warned her. That night, Chinello found her mother sitting in the dark, the letter crumpled in her lap. "Mama," the girl whispered, kneeling beside her, "talk to me." Adeaze looked at her daughter's frightened face, and something in her refused to break in front of the child. "Your father did not lie to us," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I do not know how yet, but I am not finished." Alone, betrayed, and mocked all over again as the foolish widow who chased a fantasy, Adeaze had never been closer to breaking. But the story Chief Obina had built was about to crack open, because the reason for his cruelty was far darker than simple greed. What Adeaze did not know, sitting in the dust that afternoon, was that a very old woman had been watching her from across the town, carrying a secret that could destroy everything. That woman was Mama Nkem, Emeka and Obina's aged mother. From the day of the burial, Mama Nkem had stood beside Obina, cold and silent, never once defending Adeaze or her grandchildren. The whole family believed she had chosen her wealthy son over her dead son's widow, but that silence was hiding something no one suspected. Meanwhile, the truth about Chief Obina was buried deeper than the workshop fire, because the fire was never really about the fire at all. Years before Emeka died, Emeka had discovered something about his brother, something that could send Obina to prison. Obina had been quietly forging land documents across the district for years, stealing plots from families who could not read the papers they signed, building his entire fortune on lies and stolen ground. Emeka found the evidence by accident, and he confronted his brother privately, begging him to stop. And that is the real reason Obina moved so fast and so cruelly the moment Emeka died. It was never about a house or a workshop. Obina needed to get into his records before anyone else could, to find and destroy the proof of his fraud, before it destroyed him. Destroying Emeka's good name first was simply insurance. If the widow ever came forward, the whole town would dismiss her as the wife of a known liar and debtor. His cruelty was not greed. It was fear, wearing the mask of greed. And a frightened man is far more dangerous than a greedy one. Just when Adeaze had given up on him, Tunde returned. He came to her room one evening, thinner, tired, but with fire in his eyes. "I am sorry I went quiet," he said. "I was not running from you. I was gathering everything we need." He sat down across from her, and what he said next made her heart stop. "Adaze, the bank box was never real. It was a decoy. Your husband set it up on purpose." Adaze stared at him, her mouth open. "A decoy?" Tunde nodded slowly. "Your husband knew his brother. He knew that if he ever died, Obinna would come hunting for his records. So he left an empty box in the bank as bait, something for Obinna to find and destroy, so the man would believe he had won. But the real documents, the real proof of everything, Emeka never kept in any bank. He gave them to me years ago to hold until the right moment. Your husband was 10 steps ahead of his brother, even from the grave." For the first time in 2 years, Adaze felt something rise in her chest that was stronger than fear. Her husband had not left her defenseless after all. He had left her an army. She just hadn't known where it was hidden.
But Tunde's face grew grave. "There is a problem," he said. "The documents alone are not enough. Obinna is powerful. His forged papers look real. To break him, we need the family and the community to turn against him publicly, and we need someone from inside the family to confirm the truth. Without that, he will simply call everything a lie, and the town will believe him over us." Adaeze thought of Mama Nkem, the cold old woman who had never once taken her side. Their only hope was the one person who seemed to hate her most, and they were running out of time because Chief Obinna had just announced a grand family gathering, one he intended to use to crush Adaeze forever. The gathering was held in the large courtyard of Chief Obinna's mansion, and half the town came to witness it. He had planned it as his moment of total victory. Colored canopies stretched across the compound, servants carried trays of food and drink. The elders sat in a row of carved chairs, and Mama Nkem sat among them, her wrinkled face unreadable. Obinna had spread word that Adaeze had been going around town spreading vicious lies about him, forging her dead husband's letters to try to steal his rightful property. And today, in front of everyone, he would expose her as a fraud and a slanderer once and for all. When Adaeze walked into that courtyard beside Tunde and the lawyer, hundreds of eyes turned to stare, and the whispering began at once. Chief Obinna rose from his seat, resplendent in flowing white robes, and spread his arms to the crowd. "My people," he began, "you all know why we are here. This woman," he pointed at Adaeze, "has brought shame to this family. She spreads lies. She forges documents. She claims her husband left secret papers." He laughed, and the crowd shifted uneasily. "Well, let her show us. Let her embarrass herself in front of you all." He was so confident, so certain the proof had been destroyed in that empty box, that he was daring her to speak. Adaeze stepped forward, her legs trembling, her throat dry, but her voice clear. "My husband did leave the truth," she said, "and it is here." A gasp rippled through the courtyard, but before Tunde could bring out a single document, a voice cut across the crowd. "It is all lies!" It was Nneka. The false friend stepped out from behind the canopies, weeping dramatically, pointing a shaking finger at Adaeze. "I confessed to her myself," she cried. "She told me she forged the letters. She told me she wanted to destroy the chief out of jealousy." The crowd erupted. Obinna spread his hands as if to say, "You see?" Then he produced his own forged land papers, waving them in the air, and called out 3 men who swore loudly that Emeka signed everything over to his brother. The tide of the crowd began to turn. Faces that had looked at Adaeze with pity now hardened with disgust. She stood alone in the center of that courtyard, her own mother-in-law silent and cold behind the chief, her false friend weeping lies, the whole town turning against her, and for one terrible moment it truly looked as if the villain had won. Area's hands shook. Her heart pounded. She looked at the sea of angry faces and felt the ground giving way beneath her. And then, slowly, from the row of carved chairs, an old woman began to rise to her feet. Mama Nkem stood, leaning on her walking stick, and lifted one trembling hand. The courtyard fell silent. Everyone knew the old woman had never spoken a word in Area's defense in 2 years. Chief Obina smiled, certain his mother was about to finish the widow off. "Speak, Mama," he said warmly. "Tell them the truth about this woman." The old woman turned her cloudy eyes on her wealthy son, and her voice, though cracked with age, carried across the entire courtyard. "The truth," she said slowly, "is a weight I have carried for 2 years, and I am too old to carry it to my grave." Chief Obina's face froze on his face. "Emeka came to me before he died," Mama Nkem continued, her hand shaking on her stick. "He told me what his brother had done, the forged lands, the stolen ground, the families ruined." She turned to the crowd. "My son Emeka begged me to protect his wife and children when he was gone, and I was a coward. I was afraid of this one," she pointed her stick at Obina, "and his money and his power, so I said nothing. I watched this poor girl suffer, and I said nothing. May God and my dead son forgive me." Tears rolled down her wrinkled cheeks, and Chief Obina's face drained of all color as the mother he thought was his shield became the sword at his throat.
The courtyard exploded in shouts. Obina's hands began to tremble. The forged papers rattled in his grip. And now Tunde stepped forward, holding up a thick brown folder. "Chief Obina is right about one thing," Tunde called out, his voice ringing clear. "Emeka did leave documents, but not the ones this man destroyed." He opened the folder. "This is the true and legal will of Emeka, witnessed and stamped, leaving his house and workshop to his wife and children, not to his brother." He held up page after page. "And this," his voice rose, "is Emeka's evidence of every land document Chief Obina forged over the last 10 years. Names, dates, stolen plots, all of it." The lawyer stepped up beside him and confirmed to the elders that the documents were authenticated and genuine. The crowd surged forward to see. The 3 men who had lied for Obina melted backward into the crowd and vanished. Nneka's weeping stopped instantly. She looked around, realized the tide had turned, and tried to slip away, but 2 of the elders blocked her path and held her there. Chief Obina stumbled backward against his carved chair, his white robes suddenly looking like a costume that no longer fit him. "These are fake," he stammered, but his voice had lost all its thunder. "This is a trick!" No one was listening to him anymore. But it was the final revelation that brought the entire courtyard to silence, the deepest secret of all, the one Emeka had guarded most carefully. Tunde turned to Ariaze, and his voice softened. "There is one more thing your husband asked me to protect," he said, "and it was not the documents." Ariaze stared at him, her breath caught in her throat. "Before Emeka died, he made me a promise. He said his brother would strip his family of everything, and that money and papers alone would not tell him whether his wife's heart had stayed true through the suffering. So he gave me an instruction." Tunde's eyes filled with tears. "He told me, watch over her from a distance, and only step in when you have seen for yourself who she truly is when she has nothing left to give." Ariaze's hand flew to her mouth. Tunde's voice broke. "The night I came to your door in the rain, starving, a stranger you had never seen, I was not only a hungry man. I was keeping my promise to your husband. And you, with 1 cup of Garri left in your house and 2 hungry children behind you, gave me everything you had." Tears streamed down his face now. "That was the test, Ariaze. Emeka never told you because it would only be true if you did not know. and you passed it with the last food in your house. That single act of kindness is what set all of this in motion. Your husband knew the woman he married, and he was right." The courtyard was utterly silent. Then a sound broke it. Chinello, the daughter who had lost faith in her father, pushed through the crowd. Her face was streaming with tears, her hands pressed against her chest. "Daddy, I thought you left us with nothing." She turned to her mother, her shoulders shaking, and she could barely get the words out. "But he left us everything. He left us you." And she fell into her mother's arms, weeping, as little Kalu ran to wrap himself around both of them. Chief Obina sank down into his chair, the great man crumbling in front of the very town he had ruled. His mask was gone. The elders were already summoning the authorities, the genuine documents laid out on the table for all to see. His fraud, 10 years in the making, had collapsed in a single afternoon, undone not by violence, not by luck, but the quiet integrity of the brother he had betrayed and the kindness of the widow he had tried to crush. He looked up at Adiaze, and for the first time he could not meet her eyes. Adiaze did not shout at him. She did not gloat. She stood there in the courtyard with her children in her arms, her back straight, her chin high, and simply looked at the man who stole 2 years of her life. "You took our house," she said quietly. "You took his name. You made my own daughter ashamed of her father." She drew a slow breath. "But you could not take who he was, and you could not take who I am." Then she turned her back on him, the same way he had once turned his back on her, and the whole town watched her do it.
In the weeks that followed, everything that had been stolen came home. The house was returned to Adiaze and her children by order of the elders and the court. Emeka's old workshop reopened, this time under his family's name, and the false signboard came down at last. The families whose land Obina had stolen came forward one by one, and the man who had built an empire on forged paper lost it all. Every plot, every naira, every ounce of the respect he had performed for so long. Aneka confessed her part in exchange for mercy, and the town never trusted her again. Justice did not come with fists. It came with the truth, laid open in the light in front of everyone who had once looked away. But the greatest gift Emeka left was quieter than all of it. Tunde revealed that years earlier, Emeka had asked him to safeguard a small sum, money set aside, protected from Obina's reach, meant for one purpose only: the education of his children. It was not a fortune, but it was enough to send Chinelo back to school with her head high and to promise little Kalu a future his father had dreamed for him. That was how a man who died with nothing in the eyes of the town managed from beyond the grave to change his family forever. On a quiet evening, back in her true home, Adiaze took the small framed photograph of Emeka and hung it in its rightful place on the wall of the sitting room. She stood before it for a long moment. Then she took the little brass key from around her neck, the key she had guarded for 2 years without knowing what it meant, and she set it down in an open box on the table, empty now, its work finally done. She did not cry. She only smiled softly at her husband's face and whispered, "You never left us at all." And later that night, when the rain began to fall again on the roof, Chinelo did something her mother did not ask her to do. She set a full plate of food at the table by the door and left it there. Adiaze watched her, a question in her eyes. Her daughter only shrugged and gave a small smile. "In case someone comes in the rain," she said, and Adiaze understood. The kindness her husband had planted, the kindness that had saved them all, had taken root in the next generation. Some things, it turns out, can never be stolen. They can only be passed on.